This is the Techstart podcast. Tech professionals, remote workers, and entrepreneurs who are leaving the rat race and starting a new life in Southern Colorado.
Welcome to the show. I'm here with my co-host, Ash Arnold, and today I'm excited to have Blair Parkhill on the show with us. So welcome to the show, Blair.
Thanks, Matthias. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
It's awesome. I was really excited to have you on the show this time, and I thought it'd be fun to open up with the listeners and fill them in a little bit about where you're at, where you're living, and what you're living in. Do you want to fill us in just briefly before we get in?
Well, yeah, I'm dialed in to this podcast from about 8,700 feet above sea level, staring squarely at Pikes Peak and its glorious peak right outside of my sunroom window of my tiny house. I live in a 400 square foot tiny house. I'm the owner of another tiny house that's about 360 square feet, and I've chosen to make the big move from suburbia all the way up into the mountains and living tiny.
That's awesome. I think it's kind of the dream to do that in terms of remote work and remote possibilities. I was curious to know. I thought it'd be a great place to start. Just a little bit about telling us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then I'd love to hear more about your story about what brought you on this journey.
Oh, that sounds like a fun discussion. So, I'm 48 years old. I consider myself a late bloomer. I feel like I'm 35 in a lot of ways. And it might have something to do with the fact that I'm a serious procrastinator. So maybe even getting older is something I'm trying to procrastinate against. But I grew up. I grew up with a great family. My father traveled a bunch for his work, and so I became very acquainted with moving from place to place across the United States. And we're a very, again, blessed family. We had great relationships, and it was a pretty easy life. And mom and dad were baby boomers, and as we know, baby boomers figured that the way to make a living was to work hard at a job, have a job for a long career, retire after that long career, and kind of live your life, free from kids and debt in a lot of ways, and just kind of enjoy kind of those twilight years. And so, I grew up in a family much like that. And I'm currently what I call a digital nomad in a gig economy. A digital nomad meaning that I work from many different locations. The company I work for is called Login VSI. They're a company based out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I'm the director of products for this company. So it's really quite fun to, it's hard to wake up and kind of meet them at their time zone, but it's still pretty cool to be able to wake up, roll out of bed, head down to tiny home number 2 where I have all my gear set up, and I think I sent you some cool pictures of that, and just start dialing in and doing my business at 5 or 6, about 6 o'clock in the morning, and kind of doing that whole thing. And I make a note about the gig economy because if you're familiar with the gig economy, if you come from a technology background, some might think a gig economy means like a certain capacity, a gigabyte. But it's actually it's that we live in an era where a lot of our jobs are short-term gigs, right? And so the gig economy has to do with the fact that we just don't have jobs that we can kind of work for a long career in anymore. I'm a Christian guy, and I'm recently married to the love of my life. I just got married about a year ago. And my passions, thank you. My passions are carpentry, hiking, music, and engineering. So, that's just a little bit about me to kind of lead the way into the rest of the podcast.
So, I think Blair, first of all, there are so many things that I think we need to touch on that you just mentioned, but specifically about the gig economy, it's really interesting you mentioned that. I remember probably 5 years ago in technology, a lot of jobs were at the moment, and I'm generalizing across a variety of industries at the moment, but they were contract focused. CTOs would come with organizations, maybe for a 24-month sit down information security people would come in for an 8-month contract and kind of take over, or marketing would come in for a 6-month project and then kind of dance out. So it's really interesting to see you embracing contract work in such a way that actually is really true. I don't think technology jobs 5 years ago understood that you could freelance, and I think it's really interesting that a lot of people in technology, specifically, I want to say in a lot of different roles that are supporting roles, but even IT actually can just work on contracts now and actually be able to just move anywhere they want to move, because they're not locked into that 48-month, 5-year career anymore with one organization. They're in a lot of cases independent contractors. I know in my case, if I do consult, I've kind of moved my digital experiences, my technology experiences to a consulting situation. So I'm usually on a contract for a stint of time, and then I'm on to another project. So I think it's really interesting that you've been able to do that and create an economy doing it in a sustainable way of life. I still think a lot of individuals don't realize the opportunities that are out there to actually create a lifestyle that way. So I think it's really interesting that you've been able to succeed on basically all pillars of your life, basically contract to contract, which for a lot of people is a terrifying thought. But here you are living the complete dream, right?
Well, I'd like to think so. But I think, to be clear, too, I'm not a contract worker per se, right? I did come from my last gig was a consulting job where I was kind of helping a company with some marketing stuff, and I'm an engineer at heart. But I think, really the way that I see the economy shaping up in tech jobs like ours, they ultimately do end up being a gig, right? And that has more to do with the fact that you can't count on your job being a long-term thing, right? Now, some of them may turn into a long-term gig. Like I've been working for the company that I'm with for the last 4 years. But the mindset is much, much different than what I was than what I experienced when I grew up. My father worked at the same company from a start to finish, right? And then he retired from that company, even consulted for that company for a while. And here I look at the jobs that I've had and the security that I've felt in these jobs over the last 10 years or so. And it's like there's no security. They are becoming much more remote, which is great. But that's one of the drivers for how I've adapted or changed my lifestyle. It's a big driver, is the fact that there's a lot of anxiety that comes from the fact that I don't know if I'm going to have the same job next year. And I just didn't want to live in a way that I felt that anxiety anymore. And I wanted to change how I lived to be much more adaptable and flexible. So if changes do come along in my professional status, I can just kind of flow into them. And so I feel like I work in a gig economy, but I'm not necessarily a consultant yet. But, I do think that's a total possibility for me in the future if I chose to do so.
That's a really interesting angle and a really interesting perspective, because the speed of change within technology is what drives the gig economy. And your answer for how us as humans who have, up until the very recent past, have lived in relatively stable civilizations, or at least where the rate of change is relatively low, like presenting this kind of lifestyle as a way of thriving in the midst of this rapid change.
Yep. It really is at the core of a lot of changes I've made recently. Absolutely.
Really interesting.
Well, I think what's profound about it, to the point is you've been able to create something statically stable and something that changes every time. I mean, the rate of adoption of everything we're dealing with, I think, even more so this year than 10 years ago, is just so fast. It's so fast. How we do things, why we do them, what we need to research, what we don't need to research, what we need to look at, what we need to not look at, changes on such a frequency.
Oh, yeah.
It's very difficult to become that perfect solution. All these people that start jobs, you, myself, everybody, we have this great service to offer, but I don't think anybody understands, to your point, the anxiety that comes with, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to adapt to it. I'm going to be great at it. And what no one ever talks about is, okay, in terms of adapting and being great at it and being personable and showing up and being your best self and rolling with the technology, adopting it, going with the flow, and getting there, what nobody talks about is what it does to your family life, what it does to the bills that don't go down, what it does to the hobbies that have to be abandoned because you might be working, crazy hours for a certain stint of time, and then you might be able to figure out how to do your job faster or maybe slower or whatever. Yeah. The technology is just, it ebbs and flows at such a rate that it's very hard to predict. And I think it's wonderful that you took that into account and you became kind of lifestyle as a service, so to speak, saying, okay, my exterior life is the problem, but the job is not, the job's going to continue to change. So if that change is constant, then I'm going to change my life so that I don't get stressed. That is brilliant. I got to say.
Yeah. Absolutely, and technology is not going to slow down. So you have to really, I've been looking at my personal life much, much more now than I have in the past. And in the past, I set myself up for a major burnout, high anxiety, all of that stuff in a market and in a sector that I really enjoy, which is technology. But you got to think about life too as being in a way kind of a race or a marathon, right? And if you choose to sprint the entire marathon, you're basically going to fall on your face and not be able to get up, halfway through the race. So you really got to think about, how do I pace myself and how do I set myself up to be able to make a decision to pace myself later on? And, and like I said, I'm a late bloomer. I'm 48, and I've just learned how to make this decision, and we can talk about how I got to that place later. But I feel like I want to have the choice to be able to start, jogging or walking or enjoying my surroundings during that marathon. And I don't want to feel the anxiety that comes with making a really hard, risky choice like that. So, the idea was basically setting myself up in a way where that risk is much, much less. And so it's easier to make those decisions. And what's funny is, just knowing you can make that decision changes your perspective so much to the point where you don't even feel like you have to leave your job to find that fulfillment anymore.
Yeah. So you bring up something pretty interesting, because in a lot of ways the tech space is the perfect place for the kind of the adrenaline hooked entrepreneur who loves to go after the next craze. And yet we're facing this talent shortage. And at the same time, that's kind of the exact opposite of what a typical engineer is actually looking for. And so there's this self-perpetuating problem that we have in the startup culture, in which we're actively creating. I mean, you're working to change this, but creating this culture in which the talent that we so desperately need isn't able to thrive.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So one of the things. Go ahead.
You're good. Go ahead.
No, so one of the things I was curious about too, because I mean, it sounds like some of the things that you've done to slow yourself down have moved beyond just. It's more than just, moving into the mountains and living in a tiny home. There are other life adjustments that you've been making, from what I hear. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those, from a practical standpoint? What are some of the things that you've done to help lower the noise and lower the anxiety for yourself?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you it all started when I met my wife a few years ago. She's a wonderful soul. She's somebody that actually, lived in her van and, really struggled through life early on and realized that you just don't need a lot to be happy. And that when you kind of live minimally, you get excited about a lot more things too, right? And living minimal doesn't mean depriving yourself. It just means looking at certain, conveniences in your life that sometimes you really don't need. Like, how hard is it to cut the core out of a strawberry, versus buying that strawberry core from the store sticking in the shelf for, 99.99% of its life, and just never looking back to it. It's just like these little things in life that she's kind of taught me. You just don't need to have a lot to be able to find that fulfillment in life. And so, when I met her, she was in the process of buying a tiny home, and I was living in a 2,400 square foot house in suburbia. And it was a great house, and I have a couple of kids from a previous marriage who I needed to make sure I provided for them as well. And so when we met, and I'd felt quite a bit of anxiety before meeting her too, just in the fact, again, that I had what I call a box and chain. It's basically a giant house I will never, ever pay off like most Americans. And that house becomes kind of this box and chain where I have to work my whole life. I can't slow down. I can't stop earning money because the house is constantly going to be asking for most of it. And so that, I think, is, we kind of set ourselves up for all of this anxiety. And we learn that from our predecessors, right? Our parents have taught us, or at least when you're my age, my parents taught me, and by example, that, you grow up, you get success in a job, you buy a house, you get a couple cars, a couple dogs, blah, blah, blah. And that's the formula for success, right? And so that worked very well for them. But in our, in a gig economy and these kind of things, when you have a house like that, it's just this huge anxiety. And so when I met my wife and she was telling me about, tiny living and all of these things, and I'm not a materialist and I don't need to have a lot of stuff. My things are musical equipment and tools pretty much. And so when I looked at my life and kind of was weighing the decision, like, how nice would it be to live tiny and not have this box and chain around my leg for the rest of my life, and how could that change my life? And so that was really what led into a lot of the decisions and revelations that I've been having lately, and ultimately the decision to sell that house, take the profits from that house and buy a tiny home and kind of move up here to Woodland Park and kind of shed a lot of the things that made life a little more complex and complicated.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think, Blair, what you're saying is, and maybe this is my spin on it, right? There is a huge facade we put on in technology. I think no matter what you are, you see it in a lot of the hubs, Alpharetta, Georgia, to name one place. We can talk about Silicon Valley. We can talk about what Denver's becoming. We can talk about Austin, Texas. And you're right. It's always a house, and the guys, the men in the marriage usually move first, and they're stuck in a work condo, away from their family for a little while, so they can finally move the house, back to where the job is. And you see this a lot happening in a lot of engineering jobs specifically. You see a lot in CTO positions, a lot in data science roles. It's actually the rate of how much we ask of these people to move is astounding. It really is. It's a lot to move. And there is that anxiety of because we're in a generational, philosophically speaking, we're at a crux where four different generations are kind of exiting and entering the workforce, right?
Yeah.
And
a generational purgatory for sure, yeah.
It is, and it's a completely different outlook. To your point, you were saying, I was influenced by my parents. My parents said, buy the house, get the dogs, do this. At the same time, I was thinking about that, and to that point, I was able to speak to a consultant last week that's been a mentor to me for many, many years, and we kind of love to talk about how work ethics have changed and whatnot. And working in this field that is so competitive and so taxing, we are asking people to innovate and create and throw this rapid rate of consumption at these problems we solve with technology and data every day. I mean, honestly, the creative process has been sped up, I think, probably, I call it like 20 times. We're on the 20 times deal. That's just kind of what I call it. That's my little version of saying, okay, we used to be able to actually create a pipeline of goals and look at, whiteboarding a startup culture, kind of like incubation of an idea and kind of watching it come to fruition. And it feels like so much of that process has just been, we've got all these softwares that make lists for us to do and tell us if we're on time or not on time on our project management. And we're dealing with these micro projects, and in this gig economy, ultimately, at the end of the day, we're just dealing with a bunch of mini projects that add up to something huge or something little, depending on what we're working on. But we're working so intense. And the human body was not meant, and the capacity of the brain is one of the most amazing tools we have, right? I don't even think we've tapped into how much faster it can work. But to your point earlier, how much we're asking to be always on, this 24/7 always on situation is so crazy. And here you are, and you are subtracting so much of the monotony to make things simpler to the point where, we are now taking cores out of apples, which is a great process, right? And I mean that in all the best ways, because it's important to be able to sit down and be able to actually enjoy cooking a meal. How many of us actually have time to do that anymore, right? So the fact that you but the fact that you're able to say, I like to cook dinner for myself and have that minute to just to be able to do it. And here we are in a time where, we've got all this technology, an LED light can probably fry an egg if we really want, right? But for you to take that important step back and say, I'm going to slow that down because I am working so fast over here in what my projects are asking of me that you've been able to subtract it out. So many people can't take that step back, and it's incredible that you have. And I could generalize this by saying it's a generational thing, and it is. But honestly, you're actually living now probably more like the way you were raised then than that life you were on your way to that your parents prepared you for, right? Isn't that kind of a weird throwback, right?
In a sense, it is kind of a throwback. It's more like living like when I was a kid under my parents' watch, right? I had more time to do the things that I loved, right? And the interesting thing about always on, right, is that, our brains have this wonderful capacity to handle so much. And, being put into stressful situations and see how we respond and succeed and all that is awesome. But I'm an INTJ, if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs. And so I love solving problems, but I'm also highly creative. And one of the things I found is that while I have the capacity to deal with a lot of stress and to get a lot of things done when I need to, the thing that seems like to me is that the brain balances that part of your objective versus your creativity. So, for example, if I'm working 16-hour days and I'm constantly under the gun to get things done, my brain's going to focus more on getting things done, and I'm really going to start to eat at my creative process. And that's one of the things that I found about our current social, economic, professional careers, is that we're starting to sacrifice a lot of creativity in our lives. And until, my personal opinion, and maybe this has more to do with my age, I don't know, but until you have that opportunity to sit back and cook a meal or stare at the stars for 30 minutes or sit under the sun with your eyes closed for 30 minutes, you'll never reap the rewards of a powerful creativity. And it's that creativity that spurred all of the innovation that we see today. So I feel like we're starting to kind of burn the candle at two ends with how hard we're kind of going at technology. And if we don't kind of think about what we're doing and we don't kind of slow down a little bit and at least trade a little bit of that time for, kind of slowing down a little bit, we're going to kill our creativity. And then we're pretty much just robots, and we know what's going to happen with those jobs.
Yeah.
Something that just strikes me as really interesting about what you just said is, on my personal journey, which relates to yours in a very strange way, I unplugged completely for 8 months of my life. No phone, no computers, no nothing, right? 8 months straight, just nothing, just cold turkey. Nobody could find me. And that was enough. That was a jarring of enough experience to give me a complete shell shock. Just, I didn't know what to do with myself, right? Because I couldn't type. You know, I'm so used to thinking through typing on a computer, right? I'm so used to brainstorming a company by just, you know, okay, I've got to get, you know, my Excel spreadsheet and, you know, my mind map software out, and that's how I'm going to think. And I've been thinking that way for so many years that when I had to sit with a pen and paper and kind of articulate to myself, I found something very interesting happen. I could not even write incomplete sentences anymore. Has anyone else experienced that, Matthias? Have you ever done that? Have you ever just taken a minute to unplug yourself completely? I wrote in bullet points to myself, and I realized at the end of this experiment that I was writing it like I was writing software, and how is anybody going to follow my directions because I wasn't writing the story?
That's the creative part of it, the story, you know?
Yeah.
I totally lost how to tell a story. I could not write it on paper anymore. And to your point, I took a long time, and, you know, I started going, you know, at dusk I went on a walk, and at daybreak I went on a walk, probably maybe what you guys do or don't do. But I realized that I've been communicating so short, working so fast with all these great tools I have, that I could not write down and write 5 solid pages of a business plan, paragraph sentences without spell check and without a keyboard. And it scared me a little bit. It honestly scared me a little bit. And I don't know if anybody here has been through something like that, but that was just from unplugging, just for, you know, a very small period of time, you know, in my career. And I realized what I was losing from myself, much like you. I realized what I had subtracted from my life because I relied on my tools too much and no more thinking because I was always on. And then when I slowed myself down long enough to look around, it took me a while to appreciate how long the intellectual process actually takes. And I thought that was interesting because you were saying, you know, you slowed your life down, and I threw all technology away, and I realized that I was almost handicapping myself, and I was just wondering if either of you have gone through anything like that.
I've definitely gone through that. I mean, that's as I talked about in my past with this high anxiety job and that kind of stuff. Hey, you know, that was, I basically said, how can I save a little time just so I can kind of free up a little to do more? And it's just this terrible, you know, perpetuating issue. I tried using Evernote, for example, which is an awesome piece of software. And I was typing in all my notes and everything, but the problem with it was like a data dumpster. I'd put all my great notes in there. And the problem with typing everything on a computer screen is your brain doesn't remember like proximity and location and things like that when it's on a computer screen. It's just all one blob. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I went back to my beautiful Ampad Quadrille ring-bound notepad, engineering notepad, of course, because I'm an engineer. And I got my Uniball Signo Ultra Micro pen, which writes like this super fine point. I can put like 1 million words on one page. But the cool part about all of that is when I take notes, I actually remember what I wrote because I remember where it was on the page. And so it's in a way it's creative because I get to choose how I put it on the page, how I write. I am writing more. And so, yeah, I've experienced that as well. And it's funny to look at the relationship your brain has with different types of media.
That's absolutely right. I think, Blair, it's well worth emphasizing what you're saying because I think it's easy to blow past it. Like especially in the startup space, or if you're in any form of leadership, or you're launching a company, or just leading a team, it's so easy to let the demands and pressures of life squeeze that creativity out of you. I mean, if we do nothing else but pause, and if the listeners do nothing but take that to heart and start applying that, I mean, it's huge.
Yep. Yeah, and the cool thing about the cool thing about the whole tiny house thing, right, is for me it wasn't, I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I want to live in a house that's, 1/5 the size of the house that I'm living in now, right? I wanted to live in a way that was kind of free from a certain anxiety that I had about always having to make a lot of money and pay for this big box and chain. And so even freeing up a little mental capacity of things that you worry about, all the time, it opens you up to be a little more free to think and do things freely,
Yeah, that's really true. So one of the questions that I had is, I think when you're in this place where, you're redlining it, you're running it just at the edge of what you can handle, and there's more to do than what you're getting to. It's hard to, and when you're weighed down by the chain, it's hard to imagine what life can be like. And I'm curious if you can describe, can you kind of give us a picture of the before and after without the pressure?
I definitely I can do that. But also realize that my life took on this change just over about 1.5 years ago. So I'd say I'm kind of in progress, much with anything in life, we're kind of always in progress. And my motto is it's more, it's not the destination, it's the journey, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think that the immediate thing for me was as soon as I sold that box, that box and chain, as soon as I sold that house and had enough money to put a really sizable down payment on a tiny home, that was kind of the first level of freedom that I got to experience. I got to sit down and say, hey, I no longer have this huge mortgage payment that I have to work so hard to pay every month. Right now, I get to kind of revel in the fact that I don't have to work really hard to keep my job because I'm afraid of losing my job, right? Yeah. And so that was that absolutely benefit number one, was the fact that now I get to work because I want to, not because I have to. And that was just huge. It really kind of eases the mind. It takes a lot of weight, it takes off a lot of pressure, a huge amount of anxiety. And, and it's not to say that I don't work hard. And there are absolutely weeks on end where I do kind of work and wish I had a little time to do something different. But, there's a task at hand. I want to get it done, and I'm going to see it through. And so it ebbs and flows a little bit, and so I still go through those periods. But just knowing that if I ever wanted to say, enough, it's starting to own me a little bit, the choice to say, I want to do a consulting job for the next 6 months from Costa Rica, I could make that call if I wanted to. But just the way that I feel about my job now, it's like, no, I will definitely go to Costa Rica, but I'm not going to take on a new consulting job just because I love who I work with, and I've changed my mindset about being a professional and that kind of stuff. So definitely, a big part of it. I will say, though, that I am really looking forward to the next stage of life, right? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I have a couple of kids, and they're 17 and 18 now. So I've got one in college and the other one's graduating high school soon, and she's got a car now, and it's so great to see them kind of flourish on their own. And so, seeing them kind of being successful out on their own and having this wonderful marriage with my wife, that's now 1 year old. It's like a lot of new things in my life, and and with new things, you definitely want to give a lot of care and feeding and all that stuff. And so I'm looking forward to kind of not exiting, but transitioning, into this life a little more wholeheartedly now that I've worked so hard to kind of make a lot of it happen. So things like, it sounds easy to sell a house and move into a tiny home, right? But you got six rooms in a standard, big suburban house. And, if you're like me, every room has to have a piece of furniture in it. If you don't have room for some things, then you'll stash it in a closet. And so, it took 3 to 6 months just to empty my house enough so that I could fit everything else in a 10 by 10 storage unit and in my tiny home. And so that was not easy, but I knew every time I let go of something, it did feel kind of a sense of peace and release, and there wasn't this heavy energy. So I'd say right now, after about a year and a few months of kind of making that transition up to Woodland Park, living tiny, working at cooperative workspaces and things like that, I'm getting to that part in my life now where all of those things is kind of geared up, ready to go, and it's just a matter of kind of hopping on and taking the ride, And so, we got rid of the 10 by 10 storage unit. We're now fully into 2 tiny homes at the moment, and we'll be taking the other tiny home into kind of an Airbnb type of thing, which I'm happy to talk about too. But there's that. We're building another tiny home in Costa Rica, and lots of good, fun stuff still happening with the job. So there's still so much more ahead. But basically making that huge transition from the suburban life, box and chain, standard lifestyle that a huge percentage of Americans live, to this new minimal, tiny living type of lifestyle. It takes a lot of effort. So it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for those that are afraid of commitment, right? So it's nice to be on the other side of that right now, and I'm feeling just in the last month or two, just like we're starting to coast a little bit, and it's starting to really gain some momentum.
That's really cool. I think that transparency is awesome, because I think so many times we see the picture painted on the other side of like, here's the glamour, but it's interesting to hear you talk about the price that you've had to pay in order to get to that and to get that to that level of simplicity and peace.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on even on the work side of things, working with a remote team, and there's kind of this productivity tension between if you're all in the same room and getting things done versus having the higher creativity and disconnection, but then the challenges of kind of communication and some of the things that happen. What's your experience been like with that?
That's a great question. I love this question, and I can't wait to talk about it. So like, here's the first thing that happened, right? When I got this job 4 years ago, I came from a standard, I'm not going to say 9 to 5 office job, because it was more like 6 to 6, 6 to 9, office job. But the hard part for me was when I started working remotely. And again, the company that I work for is based out of Amsterdam. And so, number one, they have a big time difference. And number two, I'm sitting, how many miles away from them. I've got no peers to kind of talk to face and work with. And so I think the first thing that I really recognized as being really troublesome and hard to conquer was the fact that when you go into the office at 6 in the morning, and you work till 6 in the evening, you leave that office at 6 in the evening going, hey, I just put in a 12-hour day, right? But the reality of that was you got into the office at 6, you had a cup of coffee, you probably had to make the coffee because you're the first one there. And so, at 6:30, you're just sitting down behind your computer, you're spending an hour at least catching up on email, and then everybody starts coming in, and for the next 2 hours, you're saying hi, you're catching up on the weekend or whatever happened last night, and next thing you know, you got 3 or 4 meetings. You got lunch, you have a couple more meetings, and then you're sitting behind your desk and trying to catch up from missing all that stuff. And so if you really, really analyze your day working in an office, it's not really a 12-hour day. It's more like a 4-hour day. And so, for me, going from an office to home, I'm feeling really unproductive because I feel like I'm distracted by everything around me, and I'm only getting I'm doing 6 hours a day of really concentrated and focused work. And it took me at least 2 years to realize, by going into the office and hanging out with everybody else, to realize that 4 hours is actually a good day. And so I stopped putting all this guilt on myself that, 4 concentrated hours was a bad thing, because it's really not, and if I'm getting
really interesting.
Yep.
That is really interesting. Wow.
And so,
I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, and so the other cool thing was when you work for a Dutch company who's an 8-hour difference from the Mountain Time Zone, waking up at 5:30 in the morning, rolling out of bed, hopping on the computer at 6 in the morning. Your morning starts at 6. Their day ends at about 10 o'clock a.m. our time. So they're all leaving the office at that time, and we have a great U.S. team too. So, I still support the teams East Coast through West Coast here. But the cool part is, 9 o'clock when everybody's logging out from Amsterdam, I could take a 2-hour lunch and not feel guilty about it because I started my day so hard or so early, and I worked so hard at the very beginning of the day. So, okay, let's take a couple hours. And so that couple hours for me looks like eating a good lunch, throwing the dogs in the back of the car, driving to the park, going for, a 3-mile run with them, coming back refreshed, maybe taking a little nap, which is unheard of in today's society, and then logging back on and supporting the sales team, doing demos, helping them, figure out how to sell some things and kind of putting together some ideas creatively about the technology, and then kind of logging off, 4 o'clock or so, something like that. And that's an outstanding day. And again, it took me a couple of years to see that. But once you start to realize that, hey, that's a good day, and I should be proud of that, and that was just a huge part of making that transition from, the office worker to kind of that remote worker, and the benefits that come with working remotely. And again, it feeds your creativity to be able to take a run for a few miles, every other day or something like that. It's a big benefit.
That's really profound again.
Yeah, it is. It's such a great way to look at it because that's the thing. No one ever talks about the guilt one feels working remotely because people in the office traditionally have. I'll say now it's more acceptable than it was, but I know that it's a huge culture shock when people find out you work remote because the assumption is you're not working. And so when you're going in that way, right, when you go in that way, what that does to a person can really be taxing because that guilt, as you say, I mean, it's there. And I know a lot of remote workers who, on the flip side of it, do get the opportunity to work from home, have the access to do what you're saying, but don't allow themselves the permission to do it because they feel they have to work twice as hard being at home sometimes. And so the fact that you kind of can break the day down into, you're absolutely right. If you think about 6 hours of, 4 to 6 hours of quality, knowledgeful working that's uninterrupted, actually addressing what you're in business of doing rather than the small talk and rather than the busy work, right? But just getting down to the brass tacks of what you're in the business of doing and really being deep about it. And then being able to be okay with walking out, I think is the crux that we're facing. A lot of people still haven't adopted the fact that people can work from home, but what I don't think they realize is that the people that do work remote have a tendency to work an 18-hour day at home, right?
Yeah, always right, because it's always in front of you,
Because it's always, and the notion is you can't walk away. And for you to address that, I think is a huge point to how not to do it, right? You can get up. You can walk away, right?
Yep. And if I hadn't suffered from my anxiety periods before in my 60-hour weeks, if I hadn't suffered from that, I probably would, still be curious about what's going on, and stay logged in and things like that. But I have to say there's one more component that's really critical to being a remote worker, and something that I guess I've always been kind of a collaborator and kind of communicator in a way where I'm focused pretty heavily on the audience that I'm speaking to, right? And so when you're face-to-face, you see mannerisms, you see things like that help to cue you into how are they responding to what I'm saying, right? The problem with working remotely is you don't get that feedback, and I crave that feedback, number one, but at the same time, I've also been a manager managing remote people, right? And so if you don't see their little status icon on their messenger, app show up green and it looks like they're always away and that kind of stuff, you start to assume that you know what they're doing. And so, I think I know that and my bosses are probably looking at me the same way, right? They want to make sure that they're getting the best value out of me. And if they don't see me in the office, how do they know that's happening? And so there's a crucial component to working remotely that I think, if you really want to be successful as a remote worker, you need to embrace, and that's just like solid communication. So one of the things that I had to do, and something that I'd say a lot of the U.S. workforce in our company had struggled with in the past, being led by and communicating heavily with a Dutch company, is the fact that, if you don't have those solid communication paths and kind of that alive signal between the two, on a regular basis, then they will start to draw conclusions about you. You'll hear things like, I just don't know what you do every day, right? Which is basically like saying, I just don't know that I see a lot of value in what you're doing. And so you need to be able to...
word. Value. What value?
Yeah, that's right. And so I did things like set up regular weekly meetings, and sometimes meetings can be kind of taxing and that kind of stuff. But if you're in an office where you're talking by the water cooler every day, meetings are BS. You don't necessarily need them, and people get to the point at the water cooler. But when you're remote, and my favorite platform that we're using right now is Zoom. I freaking love Zoom. I'm using Zoom Messenger. We're doing Zoom meetings, once, if not twice a day with my peers over there. And so they get a better sense of what I'm doing. And when I'm not communicating with them over some type of chat or conferencing system, then I'm making sure that they see things like Yammer posts to the company that I'm communicating to other folks within the company. I'm sending status. I'm sending some email. It's like you really got to take some extra steps if you want to be successful as a remote worker to make sure that people feel that I'm a live signal. In technology we call it is alive.
Right.
And so I feel like success comes from that signal back to the office if there is an office.
Yeah. That's really good, because on a fully remote team, then by necessity the manager has to put those signals in place.
You're right.
But especially when you're integrating with an on-site team, it really is up to you. And I'm curious how much of that is. I mean, you can do that just by asking questions and engaging about the work that you do. How much do you proactively advertise of, like, well, this is the work that I have done, and try to publicize? Publicize what you've been doing.
Yep. So as a director of products for my company, I'm kind of expected to do some of that, right? Like new releases, I make sure and communicate that to the entire company in a way that says, hey, we got something new. I want to get you excited about it. Here's what it is. Here's how we can talk about it. And so, I kind of publish that to the rest of the company and make sure that I'm visible in that way. And I'm not just doing it to be visible, right? I mean, it's part of my job, and I also like doing that stuff. But there are other mechanisms. For example, like I'll write a weekly report for my boss. And so he might, a couple of times during the week, like, I wonder what he's doing, and he's been pretty clear with me too, that he feels like I'm definitely adding value and that kind of stuff. And he's not worried about me, but I still have an internal, voice in my head that says, hey, nobody knows what you're doing, and you should feel guilty about that. And that's something that I can't turn off, right? So what I'll do is at the end of the week, on Friday, I'll spend an hour or so just compiling all of the things I feel added value to my company into a weekly, and I'll write that to my boss, and I'll send that to him, typically on a Friday. Sometimes I miss, sometimes I don't. But the cool thing about a weekly is it forces you to say, hey, here's the value I added this week, and you exit the week feeling really good about yourself.
Yeah.
And so that's huge. And then at the end of the quarter, if you have, KPIs or anything that you need to write up, it's just a matter of kind of going through those, indexing them, and sending them through. And it saves a lot of time too if you're variable or bonus driven. So, those are a couple of really big mechanisms. And then And then the other is, as the director of products, it's important to me that we make decisions as a panel, right? And ultimately, the decisions go to the executives. But the last thing that I'll mention is just I have what I call a product board. And that's, engineering, development, support, services, sales, and executive management, and marketing. And so we all get together once a week and we kind of share, the tactical stuff. What happened this week? What's new? What do we want to focus on? That kind of thing. And so those are the three big mechanisms that I choose to use to really stay in touch with everybody, make sure we're all on the same page, and also feel like I'm adding value and literally add some value.
Yeah.
No,
really
it's really interesting that you communicate on a weekly. Blair, as a tool, I've been doing the weekly thing for about 15 years, believe it or not. And the thing about the weekly thing is really interesting because when you do the weekly thing, you don't think anybody reads the weekly thing because you train them to accept the weekly thing, right? And then all of a sudden when they don't get the weekly, it's mass chaos. And it's really funny because I think remote working gives you that secret sauce of really being on top of how did I do at my job. And I think that's always left out. And I think as part of the gig economy, the startup culture we're in, with all these tools that kind of instantly are transparent to, are you online? Are you on? Are you going to pick up your phone? Are you going to answer a text? Are you going to answer an instant message? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? And we're asking people to create, right, the whole time. We're asking them to train, learn, digest, get their feet into software, get their feet out of software, tweak it, get a new release out, not get a release out, look at it, can it be better? Can it not be this? And we're constantly in a rough draft, right? Constantly. I mean, that's really what we're doing. And I think all of our careers in technology kind of have to be okay with being in a rough draft at the moment because that's just kind of the way the technology is working. There's a lot of old tools that work, and there's a lot of tweaks we are making on the go all the time because technology is changing daily. And the interesting thing about doing a weekly and getting that out of a remote worker as a career and just managing yourself that way is I think what we've seen, what we can expect from that workforce is really a group of people that are very, very on top of a lot of different departments and, to your point, how we communicate with them. And when you ask people to do that weekly and read the weekly and recap and take that step back, it provides a fulfillment for yourself, yes, but it's also a measuring stick in an intangible world that we live in. And what you actually wind up getting out of this incredible workforce is people that actually become more in charge of their performance than probably any review that as a manager you could give them, because you're assessing yourself every day. Did I do what I could do today? Was I the best version of myself? Was I productive? And because that question is at the forefront of your head, because you get the opportunity to work remote, I almost feel that you're getting the best version of work out of people, because it's not that they're defensive at all. It's that they think of ways to give more, right? They think of ways to communicate better. They think of ways to make sure that there's no misunderstanding about whatever process they're in, whatever task they've been assigned. They have this ownership that it becomes three-dimensional. And I think what we struggle with because of the generational gap, and I hate to generalize technology right now, but we've got 4 generations going on in technology, and it's a very interesting time. And to be able to see that level of responsibility come out of a group, kind of like we're talking about, is really inspirational, because I don't hear a lot today, and you guys may feel different, but I don't hear a lot of people saying, how did I do today, right? But when you look at remote workers in particular, we know how we did. We know exactly how we did, and we know how you did, and we know how he did, and we know how she did, because we are forced to communicate in this dimensional world where we do lose that ability to read people's faces, but we are engaging all quadrants of our brain to make sure that nothing is misunderstood, that we're working as a team, and we're working empathetically and sympathetically and proactively all at once. And I really think if you were to study a workforce, that is so intuitive and inspiring to say, okay, we're getting more out of people than we probably would be getting in a traditional setting, and look at what's created, right?
Yeah. And I think there's one more correlation I'd apply to that. If you're familiar with entrepreneurs, and if you think of all the entrepreneurs you've met, you probably think about people that are pretty extroverted. They seem to be able to manage a lot of things that would typically blow my mind. They're very unique types of people, right? And there's like the other 80% of the population that couldn't ever be an entrepreneur, if not 90%, right? And so I'm not one of those people that would be successful as an entrepreneur. I just think things too deeply, and I take too long to do it. I procrastinate. I usually will try to avoid the toughest stuff and put it off until the last minute. So I really would suck as an entrepreneur. But I think kind of analyzing how I work remotely and my personality as an INTJ kind of lends itself to solving that problem of my own internal voice, saying, are you doing a good job, right? And so that internal voice is unique to a certain percentage of our population, but not everybody. So to your point, Ash, there are certain types of people that will operate like we do, right, in a remote setting where we do have that internal voice and monologue that says, hey, I need to do this so people understand what I'm doing and so I can work with them better. But I think there's also a huge, like a majority of our population that would probably suck at it too, right? Because they don't really have the same internal voice that says, hey, do they know what you're doing every day? You might have, a lot of people that say, I don't really care what other people think, or don't even consider it, and not using ignorance as a bad word or a demeaning word, but just it's not something that crosses their mind, right? And so it's funny in technology, like there's so many different types of people. And if you could figure out that codex for like, okay, this person would be perfect as the entrepreneur and a thought leader. This person would be awesome as our remote, highly productive workforce. This person would probably be good in the manufacturing plant, and this person would be good at accounting. It's interesting to see all these different personality types, and I think I'm blessed to have the genetic makeup of a remote worker, but I've had to work pretty hard to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think I'm listening or thinking back over some of the last stuff that we've discussed, some of the points you made about communication, about what types of people this works for. This is some fantastic advice for companies who are looking to build a remote team. I'm curious, do you have for somebody who's considering it, what kind of is there anything in addition to that you would kind of advise them if there's a company looking at building out a remote workforce?
Well, aside from kind of the stuff that I've said already, I mean, I've never thought of that, but that sounds like a great kind of consulting gig.
Yep.
Developing a highly productive. Yeah, exactly. I think the core of it is pretty much, what I've put in. Outside of that, I mean, you look at some of the other mechanisms that are required. These people have to be in a setting that has, very good communication infrastructure. So, I'm here in Woodland Park. I've got, one, I think, trusted internet provider here. Depending on where I am, I get like 6 megabits a second, which really kind of blows. I can be 100 meters away from here and get 70 megabits per second, or I can be at my favorite, my cooperative workspace called Basecamp Woodland Park, and get, 50 up, 50 down, very low latency, and all of a sudden, like, all my conference calls are like spot on and all that stuff. So I think, the technical, tactical stuff, it's got to be in place too, and also for, there in Fremont County, Canyon City, you guys are working on infrastructure there that kind of solicits, in a way, technology companies to kind of plant their potential remote digital workforce there. So I think that's probably a pretty key component. And then these people also have to be proficient with technology. Like, how many times have you been on a conference call with Zoom and you've got like half the people that are fumbling with getting their microphones working, and they can't figure out how to get their video, and sometimes they'll leave their video camera on.
I'm on mute. Yeah, I was talking to you the whole time, but I was on mute.
Yeah, exactly. So I think those are some. You want people to kind of get that too, right? They kind of feel their presence in a technical way. That allows them to really be proficient at all of those things over kind of a single strand of fiber, if it were. So, I think some of those things I would definitely consider as well. And then outside of that, it's kind of, I think that's pretty much it. It's quite simple. I would be really interested, though, in if you look at the people that kind of get doing the remote thing, looking at their Myers-Briggs and seeing, okay, what personality traits do a lot of these people have in common?
Yeah. That's a really fascinating question. It'll be interesting to see kind of what surfaces as we continue to do the podcast.
Do you guys know what you are?
I'm an INFP, pretty close to the introvert extrovert, kind of in the ambivert spectrum.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I
How about you, Ash?
knew what I was, but I can't remember it. It was funny. I figured the one I am, but I can't remember the acronym for some reason. I took a version of it, and it told me that I think 5% of the population is my initials. It's something intuitive something. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I'm very intuitive, and I don't know. I was looking at the INTJ. I can't remember if that's the one I am or not. I don't know, but I did learn that I was one of those personalities that's in a constant juxtaposition, right? And because of that, it makes my business acumen 100%, and it makes me think twice, right? Which is great because I'm in a virtual second guessing cycle. But it makes me a tremendous analyst, which is really interesting. But I think we're gonna have to get everybody involved in the Techstart to take the Myers-Briggs and figure out what we're all doing, because it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and so Matthias, you asked me about what it would take to put together kind of that workforce, and I've kind of worked with a lot of different people, and I think that would I think be a really key thing for me. If you wanted me to build a powerful remote workforce, I'd want to do some research into those personality types, just so I can kind of get a good idea of how to fast path my success.
Yeah, that's really key, and there's certain roles that you can fill, and some of that can be compensated, by what types of work you do, how much you're on calls, how much you're working by yourself. But there is just a certain type of person who's never going to be completely happy with remote work. That there's just not enough stimulation, not enough excitement for them to stay.
Oh yeah.
Really
and enter the cooperative workspace, right? Because
exactly.
For me, I go stir crazy, especially in a tiny home. Working from inside that tiny home for 6 straight hours can drive a person mad. So I will go to my co-op workspace, every other week or something like that, every couple of weeks, because you start to build kind of a friendship with the people there. You start to feel camaraderie. You start to, and if you don't flex your verbal skills, your communication skills, then you kind of fall flat, I think, in other areas. So I think that's another, good component is I love these co-op workspaces. And, and I mentioned like a house in Costa Rica. The first thing that as soon as I started considering, well, am I going to want to do my job from there, which I would love to, I can't do it without a cooperative workspace because, number one, I'd love to talk to a lot of people there. But number two, my job requires me to have a solid internet connection, right? So I know those places can provide that. So I love those things.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question for both of you. Well, two questions. You made an interesting point that you can go mad in the tiny house, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the average cube size? Think about like the open offices, right, where you get like your desk space, your computer, and think what is the square footage? Think about that. Like if you're in a cubicle with no walls, but you're in a like air cubicle, just in an office, what is that?
It's like
what is that?
36 square feet. Yep, 6 by 6.
36 square feet. Mm-hmm. Interesting, right? But you'll go mad in the tiny house, right? It's very interesting because you've got triple the space, right? But the funny thing is, but it's the solitude of just obviously, talking to the devices and not having someone talk back.
Yes,
but I've got a really good question for both of you. Have you ever worked remote and then gone back to an office and tried that on for size?
Yep. Go ahead,
I
hear about it.
Yeah, I haven't outside of, I'm so blessed to be able to go back to our headquarters in Amsterdam, a few times a year. And I'll typically spend a week out there. And so by the end of the week, I pretty much had enough because I love people. I love interacting with them. But when I have to do my job, it's just really hard for me. I love the people that I work with, but when I'm starting to focus on a task, it takes me like 30 minutes to get into it, and then to be interrupted, to have a conversation with somebody that I haven't been able to talk to in a while, it's wonderful, but then it takes me like another 30 minutes to get back to it. So that's the extent of the office job that I've had to kind of go back to. But I don't think I could ever go back to going into the office every day. I can't do it.
Matthias, what about you? Have you done that before? Have you done that?
Yeah, not for extended periods of time. Yeah, not for extended periods of time in the office, but going in periodically. There's two fascinating things. I think the actual physical environment is one of the things that gets me the most because. From a remote office, I basically use natural light, and so I get accustomed to that. And you go into these workplaces, and there's these harsh fluorescent lights, and it's almost overwhelming sometimes. And so that's one. And the other thing is for me, if I'm on a phone call for an extended period of time, I'll hop out of my office and I'll go on a walk or something like that, and get moving. And when you're in the office, the barrier between from the barrier to doing that is much higher typically.
Yeah, people think you're nuts too. They're like, why can't you sit still?
I can't sit still either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if that happens, I found I can't go back. I tried to, and I was thinking about this the other day, and I wanted to ask you two specifically when I was getting ready for this podcast, because I recently went back on contract where I had to be on site for a certain amount of hours a day, and the light was an issue, and also settling into the tasks was an issue, because just having somebody 25 feet from me was enough to make me have to rethink, how I was going to go about doing what I'm good at, because I'm good at doing I'm great at what I do, but I'm great at what I do in a certain environment, right? Mm-hmm. And so doing it in someone else's environment was interesting to me, because I've been working remote for, 12 years, Now I've been on site for meetings, big meetings, much like the two of you, fly in for a couple of days and do your thing, put the conference on and whatnot, whatever you're in the business of doing. But for an extended period of time, I realized, the grind of showing up somewhere, not in my environment where the lighting's not, Matthias, to your point, not just right. I can't get up. I can't walk around. I don't feel comfortable because I've been working alone, but with a team, on the phone or communicating on the internet. I'm so much more comfortable that way that being in an office really made me self-conscious. It brought a whole new level of anxiety to me that I was not aware I had. So I was interested to see what you guys felt.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. Yep. I think for you again, For me, I think my biggest issue now, if I had to go back and work in an office like that, I think I'd get really frustrated with being interrupted. And that's my personality. When I start something, I focus on it and I kind of shut everything down outside of that. And that interruption is really difficult for me. And after kind of conditioning that out of me for the last 4 years, going back into that, it just feels like I'd rather have my teeth filed.
Oh, jeez. That's a way to put it. So what you're saying is you will train a remote workforce over the phone, but you will not see us. Is that what you're saying?
No, I love working with people. When I got to get something done, I want to do it in an environment that works best for me. And I don't think I ever would have known that had I not done a remote job, right? And now I will make any future employment decisions based upon the fact that I can actually do that. So I won't take a job where I go into an office. And the cool thing is, because I live tiny and minimal, the income I make from Airbnb on my other tiny home property is potentially enough to pay for both homes. I can, persist through any amount of time it might take me to find that ideal job. So that kind of changed the game up a little bit too, and making sure that I set myself up to not have to sacrifice what I want to do and who I want to be, and that's pretty big.
Well, it sounds like you've really had the opportunity to, as minimalist as you've been able to make your lifestyle, it sounds like you've had the ability to expand it quite a bit, especially, now you have multiple streams of income. You are getting more out of your day-to-day job than you probably did before, and you have flexibility, which is amazing. And if you take that weight down, it sounds like it really, really can set you free.
Yep, exactly.
All right, good. Well, this is an interjection for Ian. I'll make a note for Ian to edit this out. Anything else that you guys think that we should be covering before we wrap this up?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I don't know. Blair, what do you think?
No, I think there's so much that we could riff on. There are little chunks too. I would love to do more with you guys. Little chunks that we've kind of opened the box on a little bit, but didn't really dive too deeply into. But I'm really happy and had a lot of fun with what we talked about so far. So I'm not gonna add any more spice to this perfect soup.
Yeah, no, I think a part 2 would be awesome.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. I said, Ian, I think when you close it, I think you should say we're gonna do a part 2 to watch Blair's journey and find out of new ideas it came up with. I think that would be a great idea.
Well, yeah. I'm curious, Blair, are there specific pieces that I'd love to hear from you while it's fresh in your mind? What some of the pieces were that you would love to dive more deeper into.
Yeah, well, we got around kind of the remote gig economy. I think we went pretty deep on that. I could riff on the challenges of changing your life. That allows you to kind of flip it over a little bit. It's not easy. But sometimes when you know what those challenges are, you can kind of look at them and say, you know what, I can do that. So I would love to inspire more people to do that just by kind of, tossing in some of the hard things to give them a little, formula for what you have to kind of get through to find that freedom.
Maybe we should do the survival guide to switching your life over. Maybe we should do that one.
I think that would be fun.
I'm fine with that. Yeah. I think we should do that. We should do one of those. Sorry, go ahead.
The other thing I would love to kind of explore deeper is, we all learn lessons from, not all of us, because I wouldn't be in the place that I am had my wife had a normal, life like I did. I grew up with a Midwestern family who was very fortunate in a lot of ways, good Christians and all that stuff. And, unfortunately, my wife didn't have such an easy life. And that kind of it changed her perspective on how she looks at things. And I kind of, grew up wearing rose-colored glasses. But the value in all that is that she constantly asks, why are you doing it that way? And you don't really think about it when you're coming from that kind of, good baby boomer parents, successful lifestyle kind of thing. You just saw their formula and you used it, but you didn't ask why. So I would love to explore kind of lessons that we learned from prior generations and how we can kind of break those patterns and ask why more to find that freedom. Because I think that's been big for me, and one of the biggest ones that is a word that I've made up as I was kind of riffing with my wife a bunch about all this stuff over the last few years is contemplatirement. And I know it's a really stupid sounding word, but it's like, when you start asking why, you open up this huge box full of questions. And I keep hearing people saying, I can't wait to retire. And I'm going to work so hard until I retire. And once I retire, I'm going to get my pension.
And then what, right?
No, you don't get a pension anymore. And guess what? You might not get Social Security and all this stuff. And then you ask yourself, why am I waiting to retire? And so contemplatirement is about living your life now in a way that gives you some of the benefits of retirement. And then it's back to the whole ideal of, life should be a journey and not just a destination, right? It's a series of moments. So I think that would be a really fun one too.
But and I think with that too, and I got to be careful because we're going to start riffing on this soon. But the drive for retirement often reveals a life that's not filled with meaning. Mm-hmm. And so if you can pursue congruence in what you're doing now, then you're not going to. I mean, maybe you'll want to make some lifestyle changes, but you're not going to want to retire in the classic sense of retirement.
Yep.
So good. Yeah, I think those are two we could take on. There's two separate podcasts that we could do.
I think that's a great idea, Matthias. I really do. I think, I love that idea, and I think it's important we do it. I really do, because you want to know, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, I love the way we're doing this, but coming back and revisiting these conversations, I think will be really powerful, right? Because they're big topics. They're not just something you can be like, oh, boom, it's done, great, and I think for the podcast to really help this out, I think if we don't have some conversations, to your point, and Blair, you're just so great about this, but to your point, Matthias, if we don't have some conversations about how, and explore it a little bit deeper, I kind of feel like it's not really kind of doing what we should be doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the things, sorry, this is, wow, okay. Ash, I got some more stuff to talk to you about then after the call, after we wrap it up here. So let's go ahead and we'll wrap it up, and we'll work on scheduling it, whether we record it right away when we're fresh. We may kind of space these out as we release them. But it might be good to record them while we're fresh. So let's wrap it up. And I have these in my notes so we can come back and kind of have this summary of what which you were talking about, Blair, about the subjects for these two.
Sure. Yep. And I'm excited to get down there too. I'm really looking forward to just engaging with the crowd down there. I love seeing what you guys are doing down there. You should be proud of like all that stuff. I don't see that happening near as much or at all in Woodland Park, and I kind of wish that for Woodland Park. So I'm looking for ways that I can do that too. So I hope to learn from you guys a little bit, and I really am excited to get down there and hope everything works out for me to get down there on the 20th.
Yeah, well, we consider ourselves fortunate, and we wish the same thing for you too. I mean,
Thanks.
We really do. It's been. This is Blair. It's all of these people just like you and just like Matthias, and I gotta say, just like Brad. I mean, there is such magic happening with this group of people. I always tell everybody, and I always almost cry when I say it, but this is such an interesting group. I swear, I've never seen anything like it. And the coolest thing about everybody involved in this is it's technology. It's around technology, but it's industry agnostic. And so you get all of these brilliant minds that are really good at a lot of things or maybe just a couple things. But there's one common thing, and the passion is unrivaled. And it's so cool. It's just, it's really a great group. So I'm really glad you're part of it, and thank you so much for taking some time with us. And Matthias, I know I'll let you close it, but Blair will follow up on doing a part 2. And again, thank you so much for taking some time so late at night. And Matthias, too, I really appreciate both of you for doing this so late. Thank you.
Yeah, you got it. Absolutely. My pleasure.
Cool. Well, Blair, this has been a fantastic conversation. I love where it's taken us, and I'm curious, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing comments for our listeners before we wrap this up?
I guess 2 comments. Number 1 is don't live your life as like there's a destination, right? Live your life like it's a journey, and live it from one moment to the next. Don't live for kind of that final moment, right? Because that final moment is just like it truly is your last. So I think that's for me. That's just a big one, and I think that's my closing. Right? Life is meant to be a journey, not a destination.
That's super awesome. I can't think of a better note to end this on. So cool. Well, thanks for your time, Blair. It's fantastic.
Yep. Cool.
Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Thanks for listening to the Techstart podcast. Find out more at techstart.fremontedc.com.